Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Cyber Phenomena Roundtable series. I'm Mike Sheehan. I'm a board member of ISC2 and work closely with the facilitator of these roundtables, Scott Foote, to put these series together. I'm excited to kick off the first of 7 in this cyber series this year. Just to let you know, we are recording this session and we'll send out the recording to everyone after we're done. Today, our panel includes Joel Jacobs, Steve Foote, and Mark Dunning. Joel is a nationally recognized CIO and CSO with more than 40 years of IT and cybersecurity experience. He leads Phenomenati's virtual CIO engagements as a fractional CIO, delivering IT and security strategy consulting and advisory services and coaching. He is a member of the CIO Hall of Fame and has twice been named the Boston CIO of the Year, has received the Federal 100 Award, and has been named to the Computer World Premier 100 IT Leaders, and has been recognized on the STEM Connector list of 100 CIO, CTO leaders in STEM. At present, Joel is a member of the Board of Directors for the Advanced Cybersecurity Center, a distinguished fellow at Avasant, and serves in a number of different advisory capacities for a number of different organizations. Earlier in his career, Joel was the vice president, CIO, and CSO of the MITRE Corporation, where he oversaw the integration and coordination among information security, global security services, industrial security, and information systems. Steve Foote is an accomplished software engineering executive and virtual CTO, while leading software development organizations ranging from 4 to 600 plus engineers. He has successfully applied his extensive knowledge of advanced software engineering, computer architecture, cybersecurity, mobile technologies, and enterprise applications to a variety of clients in many different verticals. Presently, Steve is leading the instantiation of software factories for a number of clients. These factories apply state-of-the-art secured engineering practices to produce advanced capabilities. Steve's own interest in agile software development stems from years of experience in the commercial software market while working in industry for companies including Oracle Corporation. Steve applied agile methodologies to the design of financial applications and industrial control systems using advanced AI techniques and distributed processing capabilities that were the precursor to today's industrial IoT devices. Over the course of his career, Steve has published approximately 1,000 articles, reports, and white papers on topics including application development, advanced database applications, enterprise business applications, and cybersecurity. Mark was the global head of information technology for LE Key Consulting, a global management consulting firm. For more than 2 decades, Mark crafted the IT strategy and led IT to drive dramatic growth of the top-line revenue through digital transformation. Mark led the transformation of IT first from small local practices to regional centers and ultimately to a fully functional global team with staff in more than a dozen countries. He was responsible for all aspects of IT operations, including enterprise systems, service desk, network infrastructure, application development, and data management. Working closely with the General Counsel, Mark oversaw the development and implementation of information security and government risk and compliance practices globally that led to the ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials certification for the firm. Mark is also the founder of 2 award-winning nonprofits, Decibels Foundation and the Usher Syndrome Coalition. Scott Foote is a senior executive and entrepreneur with more than 35 years of technology experience in cybersecurity and the broader software industry. He has an acute ability to understand and map business needs to models, architectures, solutions, and technologies. An influential communicator skilled at making the complex simple and the abstract concrete, Scott has authored several thought-leading pieces on cybersecurity, from the original risk formula to risk-based access control and the cyber SA model of network mission and threat, to the recent SOC taxonomy and the 5 what imperatives of security awareness. Driven to bring order to chaos, his leadership experience includes building and leading growth-dominated products and services teams, organizations, and startups, from tens to thousands, and spans of solution lifecycle with a specific focus on complex systems engineering and solution roadmap planning. Scott is also a frequent speaker of industry events and a member of several industry consortia, sits on a number of advisory boards, and has been a member of the board of a number of organizations. Boy, guys, I'm glad I got that over with. That was a mouthful. But anyway, if you got some questions, put questions in chat, and we'll get to them if we can. We've got a lot of material to cover, so we'll do the best we can. And with that being said, Scott, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate the intros and the ChatGPT version. I was just running this while you were speaking. ChatGPT basically said, sounds like a bunch of old guys that play with technology and have too much time to talk about it. Anyway, let's get started. Obviously, this panel knows each other very, very well. What we wanted to chat about, which we actually chat about a lot amongst ourselves inside of Phenomenati, is the threat landscape and all aspects of it. But more and more lately, we're talking about the top end of it. So we thought we would share with this audience 3 topics. First is that high-level view of the threat landscape. We'll use a popular taxonomy just so we're all speaking the same language. Second will be some of those threat trends that we're observing that are being driven and exacerbated by the socio-political stress and tension that we're all dealing with around the globe. And then the third is, so what? Some thoughts about what this audience might be able to do about it, driven with some insights around threat modeling, top level all the way down into very specific details. So it's an awful lot. That's about a gallon of milk that we're going to pour into a thimble here, but let's get started. So first and foremost, the cyber threat. One of the graphics that I really like to use was popularized. I'm not sure who originally created this pyramid of the 6 tiers. I know we use it a lot in government. I've been using it a lot across commercial industry, but this particular instantiation of it comes from Recorded Future, where they've described in some detail what's happening at each one of the tiers. But the net takeaway from this, if you're not familiar with the graphic itself or the pyramid, is that the simplest of the threat actors are along the bottom in tier 1. Moving up through the more complicated, the more skilled, the more heavily resourced actors with crime groups, a lot of ransomware happening here in that middle yellow tier of tier 3. Tier 4 being organized crime. So it's not just small groups, but organized crime on the scale of the mafia, the Yakuza, the Bratva. Tier 4, tier 4 being organized crime, supports tier 5. These are definitely organized crime, but they're state sponsored. They're sanctioned by the environments that they actually live and work within. So it's very difficult to get to them if you're looking to prosecute. If you can attribute the threat actions to them and you're looking to prosecute, all the way to the very top, but we're talking about nation states themselves. So most of what we're going to talk about today is in that top tier. These are sophisticated actors. They're very well resourced in terms of money, but also time. Play a long game. This is not just a quick hit. Let's go ransom the environment and try to squeeze $100,000 out of the victim. These players are playing a long game. In fact, they're playing chess. What they're doing supports complex objectives like influence operations, where they're manipulating other countries' elections. Could be just to destabilize their society. It could be to damage, degrade, disrupt critical infrastructure as part of prepping the environment. If they're going to do something like invade one of their neighbors, they might want to take the neighbor's allies and degrade critical infrastructure as a means to disable or certainly degrade the ability for the allies to come to support of whoever it is that they're attacking. If you don't remember anything else off this slide, remember that last sub-bullet there, the preparation of the environment, because this is on the scale of military engagements. It isn't just smash and grab with ransomware. Now, we're going to talk about a lot of these different players. on a little bit on the next slide. But what I want to mention is an observation about the top tier. They all have a couple of things in common, but one of the most obvious ones that's really not talked about a lot in the press is they leverage insiders as pawns in the game of chess. Insiders to them are tools that they can use to promote whatever the agenda is. So I wanted to chat a little bit about insiders with the panelists first before we dive into things that are less human and more technology oriented. Mark, can we start with you? I know you've run big programs, you've run international programs, and insiders have always been a concern in large organizations like that. Can you share with us some of your insights and maybe recommendations for the audience?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I think when we talk about malicious insiders, we generally tend to think about malicious insiders as being rogue individuals within the organization. You know, they have some sort of an axe to grind with the organization, or they are seeking financial gain, or maybe they're some sort of an activist within the organization. And certainly that is a big subset of malicious insiders. But malicious insiders, as you said, are often pawns of these larger threat actors. And there are a lot of nation states that seek to groom malicious insiders. I'll just give you one example, right? Let's talk about North Korea. Um, cybercrime in North Korea is big business. Last year, it's estimated that they brought in about $1.3 billion in revenue from cybercrime in North Korea. And to give you an idea of the scale for them, their total GDP is like $20 billion. Okay, so this is a huge chunk of their GDP coming through cybercrime. And as a result of that, they're very driven. The government there is very driven to support these groups that are performing this cybercrime. I'll give you one example. There's a group called the Lazarus Group. You may know them as APT38 or Hidden Cobra. They go by different names depending on which subgroup within the Lazarus Group you're talking about. But the Lazarus Group is closely aligned with the Reconnaissance General Bureau, the RGB, which is North Korea's intelligence agency. So it's essentially North Korea's CIA. And the techniques they use to try and coerce insiders are the basic stuff you see in the movies for spycraft, right? They use blackmail, they use financial incentives. They'll even go so far as to engage a attractive individual to develop a relationship with a potential insider to coerce them to act on their behalf. So when we talk about insider threat, malicious insider threat, it's not just those individual, just those rogue individuals. There are nation states behind this stuff. But what really worries me in the current socio-political environment are non-malicious insiders. These are the people that are trying to do the right thing in your organization, but are getting fooled into doing the wrong thing. Now, we've all seen what's been going on with the Trump administration. They are very much disrupting the federal government in the United States. Now, you might think that's a good thing, a bad thing. This isn't just simply an apolitical statement, but it is a fact that they are disruptive. And when you have disruption, it breeds uncertainty. And uncertainty is where these bad guys like to play. They try, and uncertainty creates gaps, and it's into those gaps that the threat actors try and insert themselves. So let me just give you some background on this quick for scope, right? So the US federal government has 2 million employees, 4 million if you count the military. They have 120,000 unique vendors. And of those 120,000 unique vendors, 60,000 of those unique vendors are small business operators. And as we know, those small businesses are much more vulnerable to cybercrime than the larger enterprises because they simply don't have the same amount of resources that the larger enterprises have to defend themselves. So let me give you an example here, right? You're one of these 120,000 vendors that is supporting the federal government, and you get an email from the guy you've been working with at the federal government. And the email says, hey, I know you've heard about all the changes going on here. I know you've heard about layoffs. I'm still here, but you know that fraud is a big issue for us. So here, can you please fill in this form and give me your bank information? Now, for most of us, alarms are going off, right? Because that's obviously that's some sort of a phishing email. But these emails are no longer the Nigerian prince emails. They are being the bad guys are using AI to use the language that the person you're dealing with normally uses. So, and it's not that hard, right? I mean, just go to my LinkedIn site and you'll see things that I've written in the language that I use to write. You'll see videos of me where you'll hear my voice, you'll see my face. And so now imagine that you get an email that sounds like me. It's written in the language that you have seen me write in before, but also you get a voicemail from me that's in my voice that says, hey, don't worry about that email. I know you're panicked about it, but it's legit. Go ahead and fill that in. Well, that completely changes the game when you talk about phishing emails and the potential for non-malicious insiders. Now, wait, it gets worse, okay? Because those 120,000 vendors for the federal government, they're not just federal government vendors, they're also your vendors, right? So if they become compromised, now you're dealing with potential supply chain concerns on your side as well. What we see from the federal government side is one of the major defenders, and I'll just use this as one of the examples for cyber threats is CISA, right? And they have it's the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. And they defend infrastructure, but they also provide threat intelligence and issue alerts on vulnerabilities. Well, they've had layoffs. They laid off about 5% of their workforce. Now that might just be fat, but I know they're not getting bigger, and I know the threats are getting bigger at the same time. So when I look at this entire landscape for insider threat, in my 30 years of doing this stuff, of dealing with insider threat, I cannot remember a more dangerous time than where we're at right at the moment.
Yeah, the stressors on staff are certainly, as you say, unprecedented in our experience. Now, Joel, you've been doing this as long as Mark has. Some of your thoughts, either from the CIO or from the CISO perspective.
So a few things. One is that the top tier threat actors are really sophisticated, and they're not going to use all of their tools on unsophisticated targets. So they're going to be pretty surgical about how they apply things towards the targets that they have the most interest in. So most of the companies, as Mark pointed out, most of the companies of small and medium businesses have a limited ability to defend themselves. So they look for some of the basics that they need, either to meet a contractual requirement or certification that helps them in their business. And those are important and they're good, and I'm not disparaging them, but that means getting the basics right, so that they understand what kind of what the floor is for the security operation that you've got in place. So that's things like data loss prevention and privilege management, and when it comes to the technology, making sure that the technology is deployed in the proper ways. But then it also comes to personnel, making sure you have the level of background investigation that's appropriate to the environment, and the recurring mechanisms that help you understand positions of trust and who's in them, and whether they're appropriate for those positions of trust. And that includes things like regular reruns of background checks and training and awareness for cybersecurity operations and the like. Now, this all sounds pretty pedestrian, but it sets the basis. When your business is focused on increasingly valuable assets of money or trade secrets or government secrets or something else that's of interest to the more sophisticated actors, you need to make sure that you're meeting them with the kind of defenses that would be effective. So cyber threat intelligence cells, access to threat information and threat intelligence from commercial sources or even government sources. If you don't have a full spectrum response and defense, you're not going to hold up well to a full spectrum attack. So recognizing that the foundations of compliance set the floor, not the ceiling, and then determining what to invest in on top of that is what organizations that are dealing with sensitive information, data, or assets need to be doing.
But I like the comment you just made, Joel, about the full spectrum response. First, there's awareness that, especially at the top of this pyramid, you've got very capable players that have broad spectrum attack campaigns. But
Yeah.
in order to respond to that, you need to be aware of it first and foremost. Right. And then you've got to decide how much money have you got, how do you burn down the risk?
Yeah,
so
you can't, let me just add on to that. You can't defend what you don't know about, or you just get lucky, but you can't be planful about defending what you don't know about. So if you don't have a view into who might be targeting you, or whether it's a probability or a certainty, then you're not really in a position to put the defenses in that you want.
Perfect. And that's a great segue to the next slide. But Stephen and I were talking, I think it was earlier this week, Stephen, you were bringing up the example of somebody just vetting a remote employee, and they captured it because it was such an egregious attempt by a threat actor to use AI both to hide themselves or mask themselves visually, but also in their voice. Can you just share a little bit on that? And I'll invite our audience to take a picture of this graphic, because hopefully this is something they can leverage in their own programs. But over to you, Steve, and then I'm going to switch to our next slide.
Yeah, so, Joel just touched on these, let's call them the incentivized players up here at the top of the pyramid that you're looking at. Mark named one, the Lazarus Group. They're definitely affiliated with North Korea, if not entirely North Korean. They're also probably leading the Operation Phantom Circuit. That is a global data exfiltration campaign. These people want a lot more than our lunch money. They are looking to exfil any and all data they can get their hands on, and not just from North American targets either, but it is a global campaign. Another one is Purple Bravo, also known as Threat Activity Group 120, so tag 120. They're partially involved with the Contagious Interview campaign. And I'm throwing these in because Joel made that great point. You got to be aware of these things. So what's the Contagious Interview campaign? Well, they've been primarily targeting developers in the cryptocurrency industry, but it looks like they've been branching out to embed themselves into global IT supply chains. So I'm going to tie that to Joel's point. These would be trusted individuals with significant privileges inside of corporate infrastructure. Okay, so current event real quickly. On 23 January of this year, 2025, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted 2 North Koreans, 2 U.S. citizens, and no, for the folks in the audience, neither one of them was gone, and 1 Mexican citizen for a 6-year scheme conspiring to have North Koreans remotely work as employees for at least 64 U.S. companies. The payments that they were receiving were being laundered to a Chinese bank account. Yeah. So hang on, I see a hand, in the front row saying, wait, where's the use of AI here, Steve? Thank you for the prompt. U.S. company we've been working with, hiring software developers, recently performed an interview via chat application with a candidate. The candidate was using face swapping technology. I'm pretty sure it was deep live cam, so beware of that. This was an attempt to hide his race or nationality. Deep live cam went viral back in August of 2024, not that long ago. Code first landed in May of 24, and it is by no means the only software to enable face swapping, but it's freely available. So long as you got a GPU in your desktop computer, you can actually change your face to, with one photo, to any other individual you want. And I'm talking animation here. Depending upon the speed of the GPU, you get pretty high quality rendering. So fortunately, the interviewer in this case, being an experienced software engineer, was also tipped off to the attempt to deceive the interviewer by typing in the interview questions, presumably into Chat GPT, and then reciting the answers that he received. Okay, what's with this point? The point is, as I mentioned, the Lazarus Group, Purple Bravo, and the current event with the, the Department of Justice arresting, indicting 5 individuals. The point is, this is a sustained global campaign to place the trusted individuals that you heard Joel talk about on behalf of entities like the Lazarus Group that you heard Mark talk about. And with that, I'll kick it back over to you, Scott.
Thanks. It's if we can come up with the link for that particular video, I think it's quite interesting to see. But let me use Joel's point about full spectrum to transition to the next view, which is pulling back on the stick here, looking more broadly at what's happening across this entire domain. So the first thing that we usually advocate with our clients is to use something like the PESTLE model. PESTLE, the acronym. Some of you are probably, hopefully you're familiar with it. There's a trend right now to add an M to the end of it, M for military. But let's just talk about some of these topics. We've talked about insiders and how the top tier players are positioning or trying to position insiders to support their objectives. But let's look at the political or social skirmishes around the world, like Russia and Ukraine. I don't think anybody is unfamiliar with how things are unfolding there. Clearly, Russia has been trying to annex Ukraine and reestablish the Soviet Union to some extent. We also have quite a bit going on in China. I know we all hear about what's happening with Taiwan. They would like to fold Taiwan into China, even though China's never had control of Taiwan. They'd like to fold it in. They also have several things going on in the technology space, like the promotion of TikTok. And many of us in the security space have been saying, be careful, be careful, be careful. This supports their objectives, even though it's a nice platform and it's enabling people to maybe even build their own businesses. But just in the last few weeks, of course, DeepSeek on the AI front was released. The most unnerving thing about that was they moved a US market by billions of dollars in valuation. Billions. Whether what they said about DeepSeek is proven true or not, that moved a market. That's critical infrastructure. I won't read the rest of these. We all know what's happening in most of these spaces. It could be political, it could be economic, like the US proposed tariffs with Canada and Mexico. All these stressors are happening. It's not just in the more remote or traditionally high tension environments. It's even happening here in the Americas. Now let's talk about the technical and the legal piece very briefly. Just we're trying to present what might be a taxonomy that you could use to build these conversations internal to your own organizations. When we talk about cyberspace, we like to use things like the OSI stack. I think all of us as technologists are quite comfortable with the OSI stack. And in the OSI stack, we talk at the bottom about physical things, devices. IoT is becoming extremely big in this space. We'll probably have another panel session on that later in the year, but we know we have dependencies on infrastructure, terrestrial, submarine cables, even electromagnetic spectrum. Much of it we don't actually control. The data links, the networks we carve out of that, the sessions and protocols that run over those, all the way up to the data layer. And the data layer is far beyond the mundane sending of textual messages, XML or JSON objects, all the way up into the encryption of those entities. Now we're seeing people share the AI models, the actual graph model itself at this level. And Steve, I'm going to come to you in a minute. I'm going to ask you to comment on that. Layer 7 is typically NFS, NTP, right, FTP, network types of applications, but I've expanded that here to include everything we deal with on a daily basis, not just office automation, but ERP, supply chain, CRM applications, because a lot of us are running these on SaaS platforms that are, again, beyond our control. And that's why I draw a line across this stack here to make that observation more and more today. Folks like those of us on the call, both the panelists, but also the participants, we're using a lot of this infrastructure and we don't control it. Looking above that, let's put in a layer 8. about business information, whether it's about the individuals, it could be about the business or the governments, could be industry writ large, but it's also the training data or the training information that's being used to train those models down in layer 7 where the inferencing is done. And then of course the model expression itself down at layer 6. At layer 9, we have the actors. Could be everyone from individuals. And why are we worried about them? Because they're potential insiders, all the way through to the countries that these organizations live within. And then the very familiar objectives. CIA, that I'm writing it here, is availability, confidentiality, integrity, because very often that's the priority of our clients, but also privacy in this space. We have obligations now, legal obligations to maintain privacy for our constituents. And it's not just in the parent country, it's wherever those constituents live. Why draw this complex model? Most of us hopefully are familiar with it. If not, hopefully you can leverage this, but it's because threat actors live full spectrum. Joel, you pointed it out. They live and work across all of this. All the way down at the bottom, a lot of traditional IT people aren't paying attention to counterfeit devices, jamming of SATCOM, and things like cutting cables in, say, the Baltics. Above that, we have what we're all familiar with: spoofing, swapping, and hopping to move around in the data layers. Certainly, they mess with networks, but how about the BGP? Rather than our own networks, how about the internet itself and the Border Gateway Protocol? 3 times in the last 15 years, China has hijacked, intentionally or accidentally, they have hijacked major portions of the internet and routed traffic through their geographies. And many folks didn't even know it had happened. Port scanning, SIN flooding at the transport level, at the session level. The most important thing here is, of course, man in the middle, because we have a fundamental trust. Some of that trust is based upon certs, SSL in general, but we see exploitation at this level every day. It isn't just with the interference of the exchange here, but we see data tampering. That's the integrity violations. We see deep fakes like Stephen just talked about, with vetting of inbound staff. And of course, ransomware happens at this level where someone encrypts things and won't give it back. At the application level, the supply chains and software here are prime real estate for attacks from these nation state players, which is why they're trying to insert humans, but they're also going into our repositories in places like GitHub, and they're inserting dependency obfuscation. And we'll talk about this in a minute. I'm going to ask all you guys to weigh in on this. Let me wrap this up with what's going on with information. The threat actors use it to dox us. They use it to generate propaganda, right? Misinformation and disinformation. And they actually have information operations campaigns. Some of us discount it. It's heard about in the news, but it's, people say, oh, that's the stuff of a Tom Clancy novel. It is absolutely not. This is very real, and it's been going on for a very long time. Because what are they trying to do? Spying and espionage. Maybe in Korea it's theft because they're trying to generate their GDP. As Mark had pointed out, they're trying to boost that. It could be critical infrastructure, where they're trying to prep the environment for a future event, and they want to use critical infrastructure against players, in this case, potentially the US. But ultimately, these are intended to destabilize societies through information operations. This cannot be understated. Why are we talking about it today? Those are the elephants dancing on this battlefield, whether we're direct targets, indirect targets, or even just collateral damage. This is something we have to deal with on a daily basis in our programs, and our C-suites and our boards can't continue to ignore it. This is a very real environment of global threat that needs to have more attention. So let me shut up and ask some of our guys here about their perspectives on this. So Joel, think about this from a couple of different points of view, maybe more on the commercial side for this conversation, but what can CIOs and CISOs do to help support their teams, putting together programs and raise visibility up at, say, the board level? Oh, actually, I wanted to ask you, Joel, about locations of concern. I'm sorry, that's a really tactical one, but it's one of the phenomena that we see on a regular basis, because many of our clients have staff moving across all these geographies where we don't control those bottom 7 layers.
So a couple of things. First, in addition to the 6 or so areas of acute tension. You have 40 specific attacks that could be deployed in any one of them. And we mentioned at the beginning that wherever there's disruption, positive or negative, but wherever there's disruption or a significant change, there's likely to be a vulnerability in order to apply something. And it may be actors who are not even in that region, but just taking advantage of the uncertainty, taking advantage of the churn and turmoil to meet their own needs, whether they're financial or political. So they'll apply those particular, at least some of these particular attack mechanisms, or something that's not on this particular menu, to take advantage in their own way. A lot of energy gets put into the governance of where a company operates and what the controls are and what the regulations are, things like data sovereignty or transit of information from one place to another, what rules apply and what vulnerabilities might exist or what risks might exist because of vulnerabilities. And that's getting more and more complex. In our clientele, the boards have not historically been particularly attuned to that. And the seams that are showing from region to region or country to country are getting greater. And so they need to be paying attention to those risks. I'm a big fan of risk registers as a way of cataloging and managing the change in risk up or down, up because of exigent problems or down because of specific mitigations that the company will invest in. When it comes to applying it to insider threat and locations of concern, where people are traveling and what they're bringing is an important factor. What kind of IT they're using in different parts of the world, and their transition from one part to another is an important problem to pay attention to. It doesn't have to be debilitating. It doesn't have to be absolute prohibition of things, although in some cases that might be warranted. But it needs to be measured to the challenges at hand. And frankly, the location of concern definition is often oriented from one perspective. From the US perspective, these are the places that we're concerned about. And where the threats are coming from, or where local activity is ongoing if their employees are there, and so on. But these are pairwise challenges, or even multi-way challenges. And our concern as in the US may not be the same as someone else's. India versus China may have a different perspective on the US as opposed to the other way around.
That's, I mean,
But-
just not to cut you off, Joel, but that's where Max Schrems, that was his argument
Yeah.
when he invalidated the privacy shield with the US, between the US and Europe.
Yeah.
That was exactly
And
his concern.
part of it is mutual trust, and part of it is understanding the actual natural tensions between different parts of the world. I won't even just say individual countries, but different parts of the world. And having a nuanced view about the advantages and disadvantages. You can't do work in a region without engaging with that region, but do so with open eyes. And you can't just say, well, we can do it without technology. The chances of that actually being effective work is going to be very low. So there's a nuance here that needs to be accounted for in these engagements. I'll also note that the matrices here that you've laid out really are derivative of things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, contextual choices about under these circumstances, this is what a threat actor is likely to do, and here's your counter measure for that. And thinking it through that way is really helpful. Thinking it through in those kind of frameworks can help keep it understandable, because this is 40 particular attack vectors. That's a subset.
Yeah, that's just a starting point. That's an excellent point about the MITRE attack framework, and I think we'll chat a little bit more about that on the next slide. I'm pretty sure. Mark, your thoughts on the data sovereignty? This is a nasty alligator in terms of being able to do it with appropriate governance that stays within the boundaries of legal and regulatory obligations. So, thoughts from you on that topic?
Yeah, well, yes, data sovereignty is a very sticky wicket, as they would say, at the moment. Let's start with these large language models that we've talked about. Companies are under immense pressure to use AI to keep up from an efficiency standpoint. So if you're using these large language models to process your data in any way, you are immediately running into sovereignty concerns. All of these LLMs, they lack transparency as to where the data is being held, what's being held, what they're doing with it. And they are not hiding that. I mean, if you look at OpenAI's terms of use, they say that the data may be transferred and stored across multiple jurisdictions, which immediately brings you into conflict with some of these data sovereignty laws. They reserve the right to share your data with third parties, and that includes government agencies. And they say that they may not give you or try to obtain explicit user consent when they do that stuff. And Hugging Face is similar. All of these different AI companies are operating similarly. And probably most concerning, obviously, is DeepSeek, because they're Chinese, right? And when data is stored in China, it's considered to be accessible and usable by the state of China. Even if you want to try and get your data out of there, based on they have very strict data localization laws in China. And so things like cross-border transfer of data can require government approval. So just even get your data out of DeepSeek, you might have to go through the Chinese government to get at it. And on top of it all, we know the consolidation is coming within these LLMs. And so what happens when they start to combine their data sets and combine their technology? What happens to your data then? You can lose complete control over it. And the laws are part of the problem here. We've talked quite a bit about the US federal government pulling back on regulation. Well, that does not mean that these sovereignty laws and privacy laws are going to disappear. It means that the states are going to step in and try and fill that gap. So there's already 20 states that have their own privacy and data protection laws. You'll be looking at 50 different states having their own privacy and data protection laws. That's on top of the new EU AI law. There's new data sovereignty laws coming in India, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil. And often these laws are contradictory. So you might be doing the right thing under one law, but actually running contradictory to another law when you're doing it. And the fines around these things can be big. Meta got hit with a $1.2 billion euro fine for GDPR violations. Right, so the environment is extremely complex at the moment, and there are big risks associated with it if you get it wrong.
I like the fact that you started with the business example of the AI platforms and the LLMs, because certainly that's part of the spectrum that Joel had talked about earlier. Stephen, I know you've spent a fair amount of time looking at this from a software and systems engineering point of view. So your thoughts looking at this spectrum in terms of how threat actors are exploiting the underlying models themselves and the inferencing engines to support whatever their higher level objectives are.
Yeah, so you might imagine that there's a large number of organizations, commercial and otherwise, that are beginning to embrace, let's call them specialized language models or small language models, SLMs, because of the security issues that Mark brought up. So I got 5 fingers here, and it's not the honey-do list on the 5 fingers this time. So I'm going to take you through 5 quick points. 1, uploading training data. Is it safe to upload our corporate training data? upload. Steve, why are you talking about uploading? Well, because the majority of training of these language models is still happening in cloud-based infrastructure with virtual GPUs. Notwithstanding all the GPUs that NVIDIA are selling into private entities, the majority of today's training is still going up into a GPU farm. Okay, fine. So to Joel's and Mark's points, what we do about that? Number one, the safety of uploading training data. Customer managed encryption keys. Insist on it. All of our uploaded training data should be encrypted using customer managed encryption keys. Why? So that we know it's strong crypto being used, so that we as the customers can control and grant access to the use of those crypto keys. We can audit the use of those crypto keys and include those audits in our SOC 2s and our ISO 27001s, et cetera. I don't even want to go there because Scott won't stop talking at that point. Though the real key here is the ability to crypto shred the training data when we desire as customers. We revoke the key, we destroy the key, or escrow it. The point is we get to crypto shred the data. So that's one. Two, the training models that are produced can contain malicious code. What? Yeah, they can. They can. I'll give you just three quick ones. So the first and most popular for these smaller, language model formats, Pickle Tensor, the .pt format. That's been displaced by Safe Tensor format because the Pickle Tensor format would allow someone like me to embed executable code such that that code gets executed at inference time on-prem in the production environment. You do not want that. The GGUF also has vulnerabilities, and so too does the Onyx footprint, ONNX. And by the way, because I'm on the topic, if any of us are running the DeepSeek R1 model, download it. You heard Mark mention Hugging Face. You download it, you're running locally. Good luck. I hope it's in sandbox. All right, that's two. Three, can these LLM models, can they be reversed to yield the original training data? Because that's my corporate intellectual property. I don't want that disclosed. The short answer, yes. In 2023, there was an excellent paper written that disclosed the scalable extraction of training data from production language models. Yes, sounds incredible. It's not. It is a reversible process. And it is not just reversible. You can reverse it for purposes of neutering some of these models to protect sensitive data that slipped into your trained models. So yes, the training data can be reversed from large language models and small/specialized language models. 4, prompt privacy. Okay, so most of you probably heard this. Mark mentioned the DeepSeek, situation. You probably saw the press. It was pretty easy for some cyber hackers on the white hat side to actually discover a database for DeepSeek, users and all the prompts. Why are we storing all these things? I don't know, but the point is that it is possible to disclose the contents of the prompts, especially when you're working with the likes of the DeepSeek, ChatGPT, whatnot, in attempts to jailbreak. What you want to get educated on, to Joel's point earlier in the discussion, prompt leaking. Prompt leaking up in the cloud, but prompt leaking also for those employees that might be the insiders that we talked about earlier that are trying to exfil the details of some of our corporate data from those small language models, those specialized language models that we paid for that contain our corporate intellectual property. And lastly, 5, prompt injection. OWASP has done a good piece on this about prompt injection. Another one came from AWS over on the Amazon side, not specific to AWS infrastructure, just in the abstract of great discussions about this to raise awareness, but not a lot of people know about it. 2 types of prompt injection, indirect and direct. The indirect is the nefarious one. I, as an employee, can actually embed prompt commands for our inference engine into corporate data documents at the end of a Word doc or a PDF or something like that. And then that gets sucked up in the next training phase. And at some point, it's laying latent there waiting for me to execute. I'll be able to execute that code through a separate indirect prompt. I can prompt for the information and cause those commands to be pulled forward. Sounds like science fiction? It's not. It's happening. The direct version is a little bit more straightforward. You've seen examples of, I just talked about it, the prompt privacy and jailbreaking of prompts with ChatGPT and whatnot. Consider the direct injections could be attempts, again, exfil from the corporate intellectual property that was used to train the private model that's running on-prem. I'm going to leave you with this one thought because this is going to be big in 2025. LoRa as an attack, L-O-R-A as an attack. LoRa's are a shrunk down version of the model that can get injected into, they're very useful by the way, but they can get injected into the use of a large language model for the purposes of tailoring the large language model's output for a given domain or a given style of art or a given subject matter or a type of software that you want developed with a given architecture. LoRa as an attack. Keep your eye on that one. That's my 5. I don't have any more fingers, so back to you, Scott.
Good, because we're running short on time here. We only got 9 minutes left. So let's land this. But this is in a really good discussion about a variety of phenomena that we are seeing, and specifically nation state or nation state supported actors. They are up to speed on this. They're not kicking the tires. They're not experimenting. They are in full exploitation mode of a lot of the things that we've just talked about, whether it's how do they hit us about our data sovereignty requirements and expose us to our obligatory requirements, the obligations from a regulatory perspective, all the way through to the rampant AI adoption and people thinking this couldn't possibly happen to me. It's happening. So let's jump to what can we do about it in general. And what we typically advocate for is threat modeling. Let's take this picture of the global threat and let's begin to look at it within the context of our business. And these first 2 points about scope and understanding, look at the enterprise architecture, downscale your threat modeling to something that you can get your arms around. Whether it's your CRM database, or if you're a software company, it could be your intellectual property, but downscope things to focus on what might nation state actors hit us with either directly, indirectly, or could be collateral damage. Do a business impact analysis. If you haven't done it, please, 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 even a superficial level helps to inform many things, but this exercise in particular. Data flow diagrams, everybody should have these, especially around your privacy data. We need to know where this information is coming from, going to, and how is it being processed, including things like Mark talked about, where the data sovereignty, where does it physically live on the planet at the different stages as it's being processed. All of these are contextually, they provide the context that's going to help inform our decisions. So that top level is your prep. Sadly, most people don't put in enough prep. Then we can get into identifying threats. Joel, you talked about the MITRE ATT&CK framework. A very, very high level view that somebody could get into today would be to use something like the STRIDE model. Microsoft has made it popular. There are others. There's PASTA, attack in general. There's Linden around the AI point of view. Stephen, let me jump back to you to talk a little bit about STRIDE before we land this talking about risk management. Joel, you've already begun that thread for us. And then we're going to talk about informing the mitigating decisions. So, Stephen, over to you.
Yeah, I'm going to give you got another 5 fingers in this hand, but I'm going to keep it really brief. Just a few examples of the spoofing, tampering, issues with repudiation and whatnot. 1, threats to the integrity of the software applications themselves. Dependency confusion. Learn about it, know about it, it's happening. It's a way for me to confuse your builds of your software and inject in my payloads, and I don't have to break into your development tool chain. 2, threats are on the increase with regard to identity provisioning and deprovisioning. Make sure that you already support your federated identities. That's a key term. And in particular, it's popular to tie an HR system for the purposes of automated provisioning and deprovisioning when you hire me and fire me. SCIM, SCIM API. Make sure that you've got your HR system supporting a secure implementation of SCIM so that you can proliferate. When you provision Steve Foot, you can provision my identity and automatically, but when you fire me, you can also deprovision my identity. 3, threats to authentication mechanism. Wow, this is just, we know that multi-factor authentication mechanisms are, already in some cases breached, sometimes with social engineering. But even Kerberos has been around for 40 years. That's been compromised by virtue of stealing credentials from the Ccache, CCACHE file on the local drives of the users to pick up the ticket granting ticket and actually issue credentials for the capable, motivated third party to be able to masquerade as yours truly. 4, threats to authorization. I mean, oh my goodness. People are not doing a good job, and it's gotten worse with DevOps. Over provisioning of developers for the production IT environment. Short version is don't do that. Don't do that. Bad idea. And 5, auditing. It can be expensive, but you got to meet the legal standards for due diligence and due care. So there's spoofing happening. There's tampering inside the software that you're building. The identities, I'm going to repudiate doing something because someone stole my Kerberos, ticket granting ticket. You name it. This is a good framework to actually use to begin to open these conversations and catalog them in a risk register. Back to you, Scott.
And so Mark, and Steve's put a lot of things on the table in terms of potential controls, but how do we prioritize that? I know you stood up an outstanding risk management program in your previous role. Can you talk about how do we actually instantiate that? How to get it going and get support across the community?
Yeah, well, I think, the big issue that we're running into at the senior IT level is that IT budgets are under assault, right? We're expected to continue to deliver business as usual capabilities, but we're also getting pressed to advance AI. We're getting pressed on cybersecurity issues, and of course, AI is also exacerbating the cybersecurity issues by further fueling the bad guys. So taking this sort of risk-informed cost-benefit analysis approach is really the only way to be able to prioritize effectively and align those priorities, your business, your technology priorities with your business needs of the organization. And using things like these frameworks really helps to be able to communicate to the board about the risks and the costs associated with these things. I know Scott is pulling up his model here, which is great, but it really helps to be able to communicate to the board in the language that they understand. And the board understands in particular, what are the costs, what is the impact on my revenue, and what are the risks. Those are the only 3 things that they're going to care about when you're communicating to them. So you need to be able to communicate on that level when you're talking about your IT budget and trying to get investment in this. And when you use things like PESTLE as an example, which is, political, economic, social, technological, legal, environmental, that's the same language that the board is using. So when you go in there and you talk about investment in IT and investment in cybersecurity, you're using their language, and it makes it much easier for them to understand.
So I love the reference that Mark made to the board, because you perhaps have as much experience with boards as all 3 of the rest of us combined. So let's close on that. Can you offer some insights to the audience for your experience carrying this type of a threat landscape into the board and communicating to them what are the risks and how are we going to make investments in things like our control matrix that I'm showing here? I just zoomed in on it.
Yeah, it's a short version since we only have about a minute. Mark hit the point. You got to speak in their language. And their language is more likely to be risk than technology. In fact, it's pretty much guaranteed to be more risk than technology. The investments need to move the risks. The investments that move a lot of them, or the most important ones, down are the most critical, and they ought to be prioritized. In the control matrix, and this is something we've seen directly with clients over the last few years, there's a full spectrum or a full matrix of possibilities: preventative, detective, corrective, versus, and plotted against administrative, physical, and technical. everybody wants to find the preventative technical solution, preventative technical control that will solve all the problems. And they miss the fact that one, it won't, and two, there are other options to employ to manage the risks and mitigate them with specific controls. And the board needs to understand that there isn't a silver bullet in that one box out of 9.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joel. Thank you guys very much. Let us leave with a list of recommendations. We're not going to walk through this. Take a screenshot if you'd like, but we've all walked in these shoes for a while now. The reality is that almost every CISO from the SMB up is dealing with nation state players, sophisticated actors, and we're all living on infrastructure we don't own and we don't control. This all needs to factor into the story that we put together for not just the strategy, but the development of the program and how we make investments. Mike, we have stuffed an elephant into a thimble. Let me hand it back to you for wrap up.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. And thank you, Mark, Steve, and Joel. This was a very informative session. As mentioned, we did record the session. So for those of you who would like to see it again or share it with your teammates, we will get it out to you within the next day or two. If you're interested in talking more to any of the panelists or Phenomenati, we were blessed to have the Phenomenati team today. Typically won't be the case where we get these 4 all-stars in one panel. We can help facilitate an introduction with one of their representatives if you'd like. I recommend you go to their website, phenomenati.com. Also, let me know if you're interested in receiving CPEs for this event. Our next briefing will be Thursday, March 20th. March 26th, Surviving Cyber Entropy, Your Ever-Expanding Vulnerabilities in Attack Surfaces, at the same time, 12 p.m. That concludes this briefing. I'd like to thank everyone for participating and wish you all a great day.
Thanks
Take
all.
care, everyone.